everyone. Welcome back to the Imperfect Podcast. I'm here today with Aundrea Morales. Aundrea is just such an amazing person who I was actually connected with about a month ago by our mutual friend because we both have a passion to fight human trafficking. Aundrea actually works at A21, which is an anti-human trafficking organization, and she just has a really amazing journey of how her eyes were open to this issue and the ways that she's witnessed it happening. So I'm really excited to just sit down and have this conversation with her and kind of get into the details of like what human trafficking really looks like in our backyards and more. So thank you, Aundrea, for being here and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Kirstin. It's truly an honor. I love, for one, getting to know your heart and just sharing more of what the Lord is doing in my life. So,
Yeah, I'm so excited. We had a conversation before this podcast and it was amazing, and Aundrea has so much wisdom and passion to share. So I'm really excited to dive into it. Like I just mentioned, on you work at A21. For anyone that's
yeah,
listening and that isn't so familiar with A21's mission, can you explain a little bit about that and what you do for A21?
absolutely. So, A21 is a global anti human trafficking organization. Our operational strategy is based out of three components. So, reach, rescue, restore. It's I love A21 because I've never found an organization that has done all three really well and focused maximum effort. So, reach is focusing on awareness, spreading awareness, reaching vulnerability before it starts, before it can really happen. Rescue, of course, is partnering with law enforcement. And then our restore aspect is really just like an aftercare, which I love about A21 is they've really done a lot of research. It's kind of been the fail, succeed at a lot of what restoration looks like in survivors. So yeah, that's kind of a global aspect of what we do. We have about 17 offices in 15 different countries, and each office does a little bit of everything. I currently work in our global support office in Costa Mesa, California, which is focused a lot of administrational things.
Right. Yeah. And I love what A21 has, that three components to it, because I feel like it's such a holistic approach, and it, as you know, human trafficking is such a complex issue, and you do have to approach it from prevention, rescue, and then aftercare. And
Right.
so I love that A21 approaches it from all angles. And that's kind of why I was so drawn to that organization. And it was the organization that opened my eyes to this like 4 or 5 years ago. And it's cool now to be like meeting you and like Emily and some other girls that I've met at A21, just seeing everyone, and gives you hope in an issue that
Absolutely.
can be overwhelming. So, Aundrea, when did you start to become passionate about fighting human trafficking, and what has your journey been like to get to that point?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I originally started, it started back when I was really young. My dad was an officer in Billings, Montana, which Billings is the biggest city in Montana, yet would be very small in comparison to other large cities. So it was considered small town. However, that didn't mean that crime didn't take place. And I think that as a truancy officer, it really opened up a lot of people's eyes to what was going on. Then my dad had ended up partnering with the FBI and actually took down 9 pimps within one summer that had sold hundreds of girls within
Wow.
summer. And so he was totally hands-on, which I thought was really incredible. And just hearing my dad's heart, it breaks my heart, but it also kind of ignites the fire of like, okay, what do I need to do?
Mhm.
And so I remember this one story really specifically that I was just like, I don't care what it takes. I am going, like, God, I know that you've called me to this, and I'm going to give everything that I have to it.
Mm.
Day my dad had gotten a call, and I was with him, and he was called to respond to a motel room. It had been a case that they were watching a mom that they didn't have like any hard evidence yet, and so they were just like waiting. And so he got a call to respond to this motel room where they were suspected to be at. Well, maybe like 15 minutes later after getting the call, he ended up having to knock down the door and found the mom who was on drugs, blacked out, who had
Mm.
sold her daughter to like an old man that had locked this girl in the bathroom. And what unraveled there completely shattered my dad. And
Right.
when he tells the story, I mean, I can only do it so much and how it affected
Yeah.
him. But coming back off of that job, he had to release the girl at 3 p.m. when school got out, because Montana didn't actually have any laws to do anything for her or put in place that would help her if she wasn't willing to testify against um,
Wow.
the abuser. And she was only 12 at that point. So you could imagine a 12-year-old girl that was, I was 12 at the time too. So, being in relation to her. And Kirstin, you and I talked about this really interesting of like, when you see the girl, you can imagine a 12-year-old girl, and myself at 12 years old, it's hard to imagine what I did to deserve to be born in the family
Mm, yeah.
versus what she, freedom wasn't a choice for me and it wasn't for her. But I didn't have to fight for my freedom either. I never had to fight. And so that realization at such a young age, I began to then educate myself more about just the struggles of what that might look like. Again, we think that it looks like the movie Taken, this very
Mm,
like, which is great. I love that brought awareness and it brought a lot of attention to the issue. But again, I think that it does the injustice of that's not the only way that it looks like. And a lot of times it does look like it happens in a living room for 5 minutes,
yeah.
motel 10, and so yeah, that's where my journey really started, was there. And then again, like I said, educating myself more and more.
Yeah.
At 15, I heard Chris speak. And Chris is like a powerhouse. Like, you hear her speak and you're like, want to go change the world in the next five
Yeah.
minutes.
Yeah.
I remember hearing her speak at a conference and hearing her share about A21. And at that point in my life, it was kind of like, what do I want to do with my life? Like, because fighting human trafficking doesn't feel like a career initially.
Mhm. Yeah.
Sometimes it feels like, yeah, that can be like my side gig, but also I
Yeah.
need to pay rent, all these
Right,
things. So
right.
it was like this focus of like, okay, God, like, what does that even look like? And so hearing Chris speak about A21 and just knowing that that's like what she gave her whole life to was
Mhm.
A21 in its beginnings, now what it's become to, I was like, I'm going to work for her someday. And if not, start
Yeah.
something. Like, I know that I can do it. I know. So from there, I really started just following in what I felt what God was asking me to do. I started out in Texas and started my psych degree, and then eventually worked my way to move to California to then intern for A21.
Wow.
And so that's now. And so my goal, like just knowing my family's heart and what they want to do in Montana, it really has tied into just what the dream that God has placed on my heart to fight.
Yeah.
So truly honored to just share it with you and even run
Yeah.
alongside connection. So
Yeah, that is so amazing. I literally have the goosebumps because I do think it is like you have this calling or you notice this problem, and whether that's human trafficking or something else, if someone's listening, there's something else that you feel really called to, and it
yeah,
can seem so insurmountable. And so
yeah,
sometimes we just don't even want to get started. And like you said, it's like, how am I going to pay my bills with this? I mean,
yeah,
honestly, it's a real thing you have to think about. But
totally.
what is so encouraging to me is hearing so many people like yourself and seeing in my own life, like you just take one step and God has been so faithful to show up and provide and to create opportunities in that. And I think the more that people are following that call, then the more opportunities there are to have a job. And to,
Ex-
if Christine wasn't faithful to starting A21, then there'd be people that didn't have jobs. And then that's like providing you to step into that calling. It's her, because of her faithfulness, it opened my eyes to it. And now I'm doing something in the film industry. And so I just think it's also inspiring hearing how your family is also fighting human trafficking, but
yeah,
in a separate way and using their influence. I know you mentioned your dad was a truancy officer, and so he was using his influence in that arena. But can you share a little bit about what they're doing now? Because it's so cool and I'm so excited.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So my dad, we laugh because he's had so many different occupations, but that's kind of what God does, is he just brings us into so many different things. And my dad has always had a dream to have something similar to the LA Dream Center, but the Montana Dream Center. So it would serve the community in the state of Montana with different facilities, whether it be rehab, food pantries, counseling services. But the biggest thing was going to be an aftercare program for survivors.
Mm,
Um, Really, when it, that came about through just me sharing, like, Dad, I'm ready to like go in this, and I'm gonna start majoring in psych. And we had this really cool moment of like God put something on his heart for aftercare. And I didn't know about it until I had said, like, Dad, I want to do aftercare. And he was like, then I
Wow.
affirming that. So I just, that's how our aftercare came along. And of course, we're praying that it would then expand into something like spreading awareness and rescuing. But currently, we are approved to house minors in the state of Montana. So that's initially where my dad's heart started. And so they actually, Hobby Lobby partnered with our church, my dad's church, and they bought an old high school building that needs to be like renovated and everything. But
Mhm.
basically, an entire floor will be committed to minors, at-risk minors, or minors who are coming out of trafficking. And
Wow.
so a lot of work to be done, but their dream is to serve the state of Montana. And also, the coolest thing that has just come up recently is that we got in touch with the Los Angeles Dream Center, and they're actually looking at partnering with Montana. So they dream centers are under a corporation kind of, and so they're
Mhm.
all together. And basically, in getting into that connection means that you can, and I don't want to say like send somebody to us, but if a survivor needs to be relocated,
Mhm.
Montana is now going to be, our dream center is now going to be the center that they would send aftercare to. And
Wow. That is
so
so amazing, and
that's
that part is
really,
news to me too. That's so, so incredible. Wow.
yeah, that partnership was huge. So just a little bit, yeah, like I said, a lot of work to be done, but that is the goal, is to have that entire floor to then service minors first, and then we'll move into adults.
Right, and so the minors that would be coming there, would it be maybe someone that was, like, from that situation that your dad responded to, where they were with, like, an abusive parent, or what would that look like?
Yeah, our hopes would be that we would be able to partner with foster care and
Mm,
caseworkers, um, and work in that, because the statistic right now in the United States is that 99% of foster care kids are trafficked at least once in their
once.
lifetime. Sometimes I can't fathom that number of all the kids in foster care. And so, yes, it would be situations like that. And then hopefully situations beyond, whether it be a rescue from out of state, whether it be surrounding states like the Dakotas or Idaho.
Mhm.
Our hope would be to kind of take all aspects, I guess, all situations, and be able to house them in the facility. A big part of Montana is our reservations. And just my dad has like a huge heart for the indigenous people of Montana. And so it's been really cool to then partner with different authorities. And so we're hoping to then take in, be an open door for kids either coming off the reservation or who need extra help. Because
Mm,
a lot of times between Montana, those aren't reported as much as normal cases, just because they have a tribal court and a regular court. A lot of the times, missing children fall out of the regular court or judicial systems that are our government organized. And they don't necessarily qualify for maybe like tribal court, or the tribal court doesn't really have jurisdiction there
mhm.
either. And so it's kind of like this black hole of cases that don't ever don't ever get opened, and don't ever, nobody goes searching for them. So our hope is that we could then open a door to that and begin making some headway
Wow.
for minors on our so
That's amazing, and I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that was another thing that I wanted to touch upon, because
yeah.
in my research, I've just been so struck and frustrated by these little gaps and loopholes, not only in Montana, but, just even globally. There's certain
Yeah.
jurisdictions that prevent law enforcement, even if they know about a certain situation, they can't get involved because they don't
Yeah.
have jurisdiction. So I know, for example, I heard about a case of, it was the US fighting, responding to a call for human trafficking, and something about it was crossing the border, and so they couldn't
Okay.
get involved it was in Haiti. They couldn't get involved because they didn't have jurisdiction over the Haitian, um, government there, and so that's why the organization Our Rescue,
Oh,
by Tim Ballard. It was his story. He saw that, and was frustrated by the fact that he couldn't help someone that was in plain sight being trafficked. He was
yeah.
working for the US government, and so anyway, he left and started Our Rescue. It's a bit of a
Wow.
tangent though, because I think
Oh,
another example of that though is how you said in Montana, there are certain things that the state cannot get involved in with
yeah.
the reservations. Um, can you explain a little more about that in case
Sure.
someone listening and has no idea what that is?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I loved what you touched on, though, is that not only is it a statewide issue in the United States, it does get tricky if we're talking about borders, as far as whether it be the Mexican border, the Canadian border, a Haitian border. What is a huge, I guess, fuel to human trafficking and the budget that I mean, it's $150 billion industry.
Mhm.
The borders are what almost fuels that, because there's so, like you said, there's so many fallout gaps that we're unable to account for. So what that looks like in Montana is reservations and different tribes have their own courts. So because of everything that happened in the genocide with indigenous people in the US, they were the compensation was that they would have their own courts, which is really great in ways, but it also is really hard in the
Mm.
fact that some of the reservations can be corrupt. Some of them aren't really serving justice the way that maybe it needs to be served, and vice versa, whether it falls out of the tribal courts
Mhm.
hands. The court systems, the US court systems, aren't handling it. Um, so basically, if anything happens and I would have to double check these facts as far as reservation boundaries and how the tribal court works, but if they are Native American and it is on reservation property, basically it is out of completely jurisdiction of like local government or any state legislator, which it would then fall into tribal court. And
Mm.
when it gets into tribal court, police officers don't really have a say unless they're under, like they have their own officers, all of that. And so, like I said, it gets really corrupt,
Mm.
um, and not everybody's held accountable. Um, Again, they don't really have anybody to answer to. It's the tribal court that they're answering to. So it
Right.
does make for that black hole that I spoke about is um, yeah, reoccurring, I guess.
Yeah.
Missing and murdered Indigenous women is based off of the millions of missing girls, women that basically fall out of that. There's not really a lot of resource for them
Mm.
to be safe.
Wow.
So that's really where our focus has been. I'm sorry, I didn't know if that answered your question. I felt like it
No,
was all.
I think it did. I mean, basically the point that I wanted to make there and for anyone listening to understand, this is why human trafficking, one of the many reasons why human trafficking is so complex and misunderstood. I think within that like black hole and gray space, that's where a lot of corruption happens. And because of the corruption, it's why there's all these cases happening in our backyards. And I love that A21 calls it a crime that's hidden but in plain sight.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's what makes it hidden. It's all that corruption. And I've heard stories of a survivor that I'm working with on our documentary from Philly. She time and time again there would be because she was being forced to work under a pimp, and time again, the cops would come and arrest them for prostitution, but they would say, "Oh, well, we won't arrest you if you do X, Y, and Z to me in, something sexual."
yeah,
And and then they still would end up arresting them. So that level of corruption too perpetuates it. And yeah, so I think for anyone listening, like the reason why I want to bring up all of these points is just to kind of get more of like a holistic understanding of how it
yeah,
truly happens. And like you said earlier, how a lot of times it will be like a 5 minute or a 10-minute thing, or, where
yeah.
someone's exploited in that amount of time. And I'm curious, I know you mentioned in that situation where your dad was responding to the call at the motel,
Yeah.
they had to until 3 p.m. until they had to return her. What was that about? And I feel like that's another example of some
Sure.
loopholes that get in the way.
Arriving on scene, they obviously removed the child from the situation, and then probably took the mother in for a briefing. I don't know if she got arrested or anything like that, but um, basically because our caseworkers are so overwhelmed, and that's something that we hear consistently, is that foster care, group homes, all of that are just overflowing with children.
Mhm.
A lot of times they don't have anywhere to take them, they don't have anywhere to go with them.
Mm.
um, and so with removing her from the scene, that was the case because she wasn't willing to testify against the man. And we had the evidence, but it wasn't necessarily enough. A fine for human trafficking then was, I think, a $500 fine and maybe 6 months in jail. And
Wow.
so it did nothing. And when, again, her testimony was everything to the case, because of the way that the state legislator worked, and she was terrified.
Mhm.
um, my dad, again, as an officer, kept her in his care as long as he could, but actually had to release her technically when the school bell rang, because he was a truancy officer, which was only regulated for the times 9 to 3, I think, or 8 to 3 or something like that. And
Wow.
so as soon as he took her off the scene, held her there till 3 o'clock, or as long as he could. I think his recollection of it was that he had bought her lunch, like he brought her a hamburger and Coke, and he was just trying to make it last as long as possible, to
Mm.
just spare,
Yeah.
that he would basically have to turn her back out, to either drop her back off at a house where he had no idea if a parent was going to be there or not, if the mom was going to be there again. So basically just releasing her back into the same situation,
Mm.
um, because again, there was nowhere to take her outside of
Yeah.
a foster home that didn't have any room for her, and that wasn't the best. And um, legally, the mom was still well enough
Mm.
to take
Right.
care of, get to drop her back off. Yeah,
Right. Yeah, and I think, that what you mentioned about her being terrified to testify,
yeah,
um, is a really important thing to focus on because even people that are called quote unquote prostitutes, most of them have been trafficked and their traffickers abuse them and manipulate them and have like they literally have playbooks training each other
yeah,
how to quote unquote break a hoe is their exact
yeah,
word, and
yeah,
it's all these tactics to mentally abuse them and mess with them, and so the victims develop in a way Stockholm syndrome where they're sometimes even defending their trafficker,
yeah,
especially kids that are coming from the foster care system or coming from being raised in a way that they never were shown true love, and so they don't even know what love looks like, and then a lot of times in the grooming process these traffickers will show them some form of love and will take care of them in the beginning so that they attach their kind of allegiance to these traffickers so that
yeah,
they eventually defend them because they don't really know better and they've just been so abused, and so then you zoom out and you see someone on the street and it looks like they are willingly part of this process, but we don't see behind the scenes the coercion, the threats, and the manipulation that has led that individual into that circumstance and prevents them from being pulled out.
yeah,
And a lot of times, even if they want a way out, they don't know how to get help. And so that's why
right.
I think these conversations are so important. And the work that A21 is doing is so important. I mean, you can mention a little bit about the Can You See Me campaign where,
Yeah.
do you want to tell people a little bit about that?
Sure. And if I can, really quick, because I loved what you're saying while I still have it on the top of my mind,
Yeah.
is one, you bring up a really great point about prostitution and maybe like the stigma behind prostitution of like, we've almost glamorized sex work to
Mm,
where it's okay and it's really like this fabulous thing. And one of the things that have really opened my eyes is that, and the best way to explain it is that it wasn't her choice at 13, and
yeah.
maybe not 15 or 17, but yet at 23 she looks and plays the part so well, and you're like, well, she wants to be there, she's selling her body, she's making it, like she knows
Yeah.
how to. And I always tell people, if you only knew the age that she was started being abused, if you only knew where it really began for her, would you then have mercy on
Mm,
36-year-old maybe that's still stuck, or even older or younger?
mhm.
um, we just always, prostitution has been this very, it has almost, I don't want to say like, people have almost not believed in human trafficking because of prostitution, if that makes sense. They
Mhm.
just don't know how closely the ties are within prostitution and saying yes. And the second part is the grooming of a child.
Mhm.
Um, One of the main tactics of traffickers is to romanticize a relationship with somebody. And gradually, like, we've had situations of men grooming girls for a year. Like, it's not
Wow.
a process. It's not even maybe a 4 month. It's a very slow, cruel, like you said, breaking down, psychologically, it's breaking down mentally, emotionally, physically, and then getting her to a point where she believes that in your relationship, that's how it's supposed to be. That's
Mhm.
what she's supposed to do to keep it alive, is to sell her body or for you to sell it. Um, so yeah, you brought, those are
Yeah.
two phenomenal points. And Can You See Me is a campaign that A21 has started within the last few years that has been so monumental, I think, in giving us a visual for what actually happens and making it to where we can't see it. Like, Can You See Me, Lamar Billboards just partnered with us and put up almost like 72 billboards, on the East Coast, which has been
Wow.
incredible. So Can You See Me is basically a visual to bring awareness to different ways that trafficking happens, whether it be in the United States, Greece, UK, Australia, South Africa. So I love that they've tried, because it looks different in each country. There's different
Mhm.
scenarios. There's third world countries where it looks like impoverished, poverty, where
Mhm.
girls might be looking for better jobs, kind of like a typical scenario in that sense. Whereas vice versa, in the US, it could look like cell phones, it could look like modeling contracts, it could look like, um, again, a romanticizing relationship. So Can You See Me has really done a great job at giving us visuals, like small videos, um, access to hotlines. People are a lot more aware when they actually can see this graphic that pulls you in, as far as like what is going on, and what does that mean, like what does that look
Mhm.
like. And they're horrifying. Like, I love that we didn't spare detail, because the
Yeah.
second that we spare detail, we take away the realness of what human trafficking is.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't become a trendy topic, it becomes this really horrific reality that
Mhm.
we're all living amongst.
Yeah, that's amazing. And as you mentioned, what I love and what I think A21 did so excellently in that is that you did show the variety in the ways in which human trafficking can happen and look so differently depending on where you are in the world. The thing that I always come back to is the basic, like, overhead thing is that traffickers exploit vulnerable individuals.
Yeah,
And so a vulnerable individual in the US has different vulnerabilities than an individual in, like you said, Ukraine or in a third
absolutely.
world country. And so, yeah, just understanding the systemic factors that perpetuate human trafficking, depending on where you are,
Yeah.
and why it is so hard. It's not one size fits all. It's not black and white. And I think a movie like Taken, as you mentioned before, is a great representation of one scenario, and a scenario that's not as common as this everyday, usually being groomed by people you know.
Right.
So yeah, I just think that was a bit of a ramble of how I think A21 has done so good, and just
Yeah.
I want everyone that's listening to understand that it really is that, like, exploitation of vulnerabilities. And so when we're thinking about how we can solve this, we have to think about, like, well, what are the underlying factors that make an individual vulnerable and how can we protect them? And obviously there's so many different things and it can be overwhelming, but that's why I love connecting with people like you, because it's like, I think what I've been encouraged by is meeting so many people that have taken their area of influence and their thing that they're passionate about.
Yeah.
Um, if you work in the foster care system or, have influence in that at all, like improving the conditions so that the kids are not as vulnerable. We have a really long way to go, but I'm optimistic just by hearing the work of A21, the work of your parents.
I was going to add on, because I agree with what you're saying. and just it's commenting on A21s. For one, their like influence and the amount of work that they've been able to accomplish with so little, and that just speaks to the leaders and the way that they've almost just like submitted entirely to God and have
Mhm.
allowed him to just direct everything that goes on in the organization. But I love what they say, that it literally is going to take everybody.
Mhm.
Like what you said is that it's we each have like a different aspect to play, and almost every job, every career plays a role into this, if we're being really honest, because whether it be police officers, um, even accounting, like numbers wise, like you just don't know who you're
Mhm.
sitting next to. You don't
Yeah.
also know who you're working for and the numbers. And I think um, I think that there will be a lot of things, as in 2020, there's already been a lot of things surfacing as far as like really dark things coming to the light, but it's almost brought this awareness of it. It doesn't matter who, it doesn't matter where, it doesn't matter when,
Mhm.
but that we all have the authority to do something about it. And A21's mission is like, yes, this is great. We have an organization that's fueled, but it's going to take all of us doing something about it. It's going to take basically all of us running into our call. And of course, that's the Great Commission as well. As if we all did what we were called to do and what God
Mhm.
had for us, the world would be a completely different place. And I
Yeah.
know that, but again, I don't mean to be repetitive, but what A21 is saying is that it's not just going to be the people in our office that change the world. It's going to
Yeah.
be anybody that we can reach that is
Mhm.
passionate about trafficking. And if I could tell anybody, like you get lots of questions of like, oh, that's so awesome, like how did you get involved with human
Mhm.
trafficking? When I like you, I could talk about this all day, and I know
Yeah.
you and I that
Yeah.
same heart, like we could
Yeah.
go about it. And I love sharing with people, and my encouragement to them is like, if your heart is to go for it, go for it. Like
Yeah.
open so many doors and establish your footsteps as you go. You don't need money, you don't need the experience, you
Mhm.
don't need, if
Yeah.
your heart first to set to learn, because that's the biggest thing, is to learn and educate yourself on the issue, what's going on, and then just serving your community. I think that the farther that we make breakthrough in the fight for freedom and trafficking is when we start serving things that really sometimes don't benefit us.
Yeah.
And look like being the face of social media or having like a lot of followers or a platform. It looks like doing like getting your hands dirty. It looks like maybe serving without pay. It looks like volunteering. It looks like doing whatever it's going to take. Um, and so it's, again, and that goes for anything that God has placed on your heart. And for trafficking, it's like you just have to start doing,
Yeah.
really
So
just have to start walking, and then you'll start running, and then hopefully you'll find yourself in a marathon and you'll
yeah.
keep going, you know?
I love
So
that. That's so good. Yeah, and I wanna add to that, like, anyone listening, I guarantee you and I promise you, like, I had no idea. Like, 4 years ago when that seed was planted, I was like, "What? I know I wanna do something about human trafficking, but I don't know anything about it." And just consistently, God has placed people in my life and experiences in my life to educate me and to just kind of give me, like, a little piece in the scavenger hunt, so to speak, and has
yeah,
brought that. So it's like, I know it can be scary and overwhelming when you have this like massive desire on your heart to do something that seems so much bigger than yourself. But I would just encourage anyone listening, if you have something that seems bigger for yours than yourself, that's a good thing because
absolutely.
I heard a quote the other day of like, if you can't accomplish it without God, then it's not a big enough of a dream or something
So
like that. Um,
yeah,
but also to anyone else listening that maybe you don't have this like massive calling, like you feel like you don't have this like overwhelming dream, but you just want to practically every day help out. Like you don't have to dedicate your entire career to fighting human trafficking. It really is just like the everyday awareness of what's going on because
yeah,
it's going to take just us educating each other and keeping an eye out if you see something that looks sketchy and you know the signs of human trafficking, there's the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Like, it's
Yeah.
those little tangible steps that are going to be the solution, all of us doing that together. So anyone listening, like, you don't have to redirect your entire life path unless you obviously feel called to, but there's just like little things we can do like that every day. And just like you said, keeping an eye out and like, who am I working for? What are the numbers? Thinking critically through things, educating yourself. I think
Yeah,
that's what it's going to take to really make some progress and break through in this.
absolutely. And if I could add on to that, I think that a lot of times we think like, oh, that might not be it, or we second guess maybe instincts on situations, even if it looks really small. If you're like, well, I'm in small town Kentucky and nobody does, I promise you that it happens in every backyard. It happens with two people in a field. Like, it doesn't matter if the
Mhm.
population is -0. I guarantee
Yes.
you that there are. Um, that it's surrounding us, and like Kirstin brought up, is that it's a crime hidden in plain sight. And so don't ever second guess yourself. If you see
Mhm.
something, report it. It's better to be safe than sorry. You never know what girl is on the other end of that phone call that you could be saving, what little boy is at risk or vulnerable. Like, there's
Yeah.
just so many different scenarios that I always just tell people, it doesn't have to look like this big scary scene for you to report something. Report any small thing. That's
Mhm.
tremendous to these hotlines. That's what they want to do. That's what they're paid to do. They're there for a reason, because they care. So nothing is going to be annoying to them.
Mhm.
Um, that I think that's a huge aspect, that, if, like Kristen said, it's not that you have to commit your whole life, but just being aware and reporting things if you see it, and just being involved like locally with what's
Yeah.
going on around you, is huge.
Yeah. And like being aware of legislation too, like
Yeah,
and sharing things on social media. Like if you I think what we've seen especially this year, and not even just with human trafficking, but um even with Black Lives Matter, like what
yeah,
the effect of a grassroots movement can do. And
absolutely.
a lot of like the obstacles with fighting human trafficking over the years have been, like we said, not only just like jurisdiction between different states and countries, but a lot of like legislative loopholes. So there
Yeah,
was this loophole called, or it was a law called the CDA, Communications Decency Act, and it was put in place in like the late 1990s at the beginning of the development of the internet to protect internet companies from being sued for anything that happens on their website so that they could expand and innovate without being worried about being sued. So anyhow, Backpage.com was hiding behind that for a really long time because the law said that anything that happened on their websites, the company could not be held liable. So say someone says something that's not true on Facebook, Facebook cannot be held liable for slander. So that same loophole
wow,
Backpage.com was hiding behind. There's a documentary, anyone listening to this, called I Am Jane Doe. It actually documents this group of survivors who went against Backpage.com, and it took them about 10 years to get any kind of progress. And finally, in 2018, the Supreme Court, sided with the survivors, and they passed an amendment that said that CDA 230 cannot apply to cases of human trafficking. But it was only through individuals being brave enough to testify, and for these lawyers that believed in these girls, because so many lawyers turned them down and they're like, we don't have a fighting chance against Backpage. And then communities really like lobbying and getting behind these girls. It took 10 years to do it, but I really think a lot of that, as you see in the documentary, is the power of the community to get behind
yeah,
them. And so just being engaged in those things and listening when people are sharing what's going on. And a lot of times it is something so simple as signing a petition for like 30 seconds.
yeah.
Things like that really add up and have a bigger impact.
That's so good. No, that's so true. And that's, again, another aspect that we can, for one, just take advantage of and have authority, and like, your voice matters. Yes, signing a petition does matter. I don't know, and I'm sure you're well aware, that Pornhub, they were working so hard at getting, for one, they were convicted of child exploitation, sexual exploitation, of trafficking. Yet not that has completely, they haven't been found guilty of that, but MasterCard and Visa stopped allowing them to use basically people using their cards on the website.
Wow.
Those cards are taking a stand because enough people said enough is enough. Like,
Mhm, mhm.
and we don't think, I think, again, the pornography industry is something that is very taboo and we don't discuss a lot because that's also something that's hidden in homes and even the best fall to it. And I think that if we're being really honest of the crimes that are actually happening, how dark what's happening on the other side of that screen, if enough people care, they can make a difference. And that's what, like you said, Kristen, is we've obviously not seen that through BLM and everything in 2020. And now with human trafficking, enough people are saying, let's like draw some attention to
Yeah,
it. And that was enough to do something. And so
yeah. Yeah.
again, that'll be another big step. So
Right, right. I love all of that. Well,
yeah.
I could literally talk to you about this for hours. For the
Same.
sake of time, and I wanna respect your time, is there anything like, you've already given so many nuggets of wisdom, but if there's one thing that you want people to be left with today, what would it be?
Yeah. Oh gosh. I think that the biggest thing is that as daunting as the numbers of human trafficking are, I know that we talked about 99% of foster care kids are trafficked and it's a $150 billion industry. All of those stats really do feel daunting and they feel overwhelming. And I can understand anybody that's presented with this issue or even has seen it like hands on, excuse me, firsthand is the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
You've seen it firsthand. There's just not a lot of words. Yet I love that there's so much hope. And that's one thing that I would want people to grasp onto is hope is that, yes, our CFO in A21, he gave the best quote, but basically he said that anger first ignited his passion to do something about it. Yeah, it wasn't anger that sustained him in this journey against human trafficking. It was watching a survivor completely come to a point of restoration and was able to get back to her life and follow like what she was being called to do. And so he said that it wasn't anger that sustained him along the way. It was the hope of seeing her restored that really then continued to feed the flame of like, I'll give whatever it takes to this. And so my one last piece would just grasp onto the hope that there is hope of restoration, there is hope of
Mhm.
rescue, there is hope of making a difference, and it can be done by one person. I mean, you look at their couple, they started the global organization. So it's all done for the one and it can be done by one. So
Yeah, that is so good. That's such a good note to end on. Mic drop. Yeah. Well, you're so incredible, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today and just share your heart and your experience. And yeah, and I love that you ended on that note of hope because at the end of the day, it is a really dark world out there, and it can be really depressing as you go down this path. But I think there always is hope, and I'm hopeful because of conversations and people like you. So I really appreciate it. And thank you
absolutely.
guys so much for listening in. Andrea, how can people find you if they want to connect with you or follow you on social media?
Absolutely. Most of my tags are just at Aundrea Morales. So Aundrea. My name is spelled with the U. So yeah, on Instagram, Facebook, it's generically just my first and last name.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Bye, guys.
Bye.